Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. We are continuing on with our unit on democracy. In our last week and a half, rather than thinking about the question of whether democracy is the best form of government, we're now going to start considering questions about if we're going to do democracy, what would a well-functioning democracy look like? So this week we're going to consider questions about compulsory voting, and then next week, for just half a week, we're going to look at an argument from Tommy Pito about why the voting age should be lowered to 16, and then we're going to finish the course by looking at a documentary called "What is Democracy?" by the filmmaker Astor Taylor. But yeah, so we are going to be working on compulsory voting this time around. As you can see, one issue that we might raise about a well-functioning democracy is whether turnout is strong enough. So you can see this chart from Vox here suggests that, here's the 50% line for voter turnout. Now, a lot of midterm votes fall right under 50%, and when it comes to presidential elections, they're really only wavering around 60%, which means that basically 30% of eligible voters end up making the decisions in presidential elections, or that is to say, 30% of eligible voters or so end up making up the group of people who actually vote for the person who ends up winning the presidential election. So the basic plan for today is we're going to consider Birch's arguments for compulsory voting, and we're also going to discuss some potential objections and responses about compulsory voting setups as Birch sees them. On the course website, I'm also going to send you some links. There's a PBS series called America from Scratch, and that little segment looks at the question of whether compulsory voting would make sense in a US context. And then there's also a short little news report on how compulsory voting is actually administered in Australia. So, Sarah Birch, she's who we're reading today. She teaches political philosophy at King's College in London. And she does a lot of research around these questions of democracy, electoral integrity, how ethical reasoning figures into political decision-making, as well as perceptions and thinking about corruption. So the case in favor of compulsory voting that we're going to look at today focuses on the United Kingdom. But it'll be up to you, as we think this through, to consider the extent to which these arguments apply to the United States as well. So, there are problems associated with low voter turnout. There are two basic lines of concern that Birch raises. One is that the less of a voter turnout you have, the less legitimacy there might be seen in the government. So thinking way back to the beginning of the course when we were thinking about Locke, as well as that paper that was explicating Locke quite nicely by A. John Simmons, the point was made that consent of those who are governed is an important necessary condition for legitimacy. We might think that the fewer people that it takes to put the government into power, we might have a lack of trust in government and a doubt about whether particular policies actually have a real mandate. That is, whether they have genuine consent from the population. And then further, there's a question about social unrest. So the thought is that have-nots, people with less access to resources, might shun electoral means of addressing concerns, and this might even lead them to engage in more disruptive political action. So you might think about things like violent protests, if there are certain people who think that voting doesn't matter at all and that their voice won't make a difference, then we might think that that might lead to more disruption in the future. So we might think that in order to have a stable government, we want to get as many people voting as possible. So just to look at some of the facts on the ground when we think about compulsory voting, you might notice that it is something that's done in some countries. Mexico, Australia, Egypt, Greece, Belgium, these are places with compulsory voting. Countries like Brazil, it's compulsory once you're 18, it's optional from ages 16 to 18, and so forth. So there are interesting different ways of seeing how compulsory voting is actually enacted in the world. We can also think about countries where voting is optional, how different countries measure up. So Belgium is a country with compulsory voting law, although it's not necessarily enforced all the time, and they have an 87% turnout. The United States is all the way down at 55%. So we might worry that this concern about a lack of legitimacy and maybe a worry about the threat of social unrest is a genuine thing, especially when we consider exactly how low voter turnout has gotten in some situations. We can also consider demographic inequalities. So Birch points out that in the UK, 37% of young people ages 18 to 25 vote, while 75% of ages 65 plus citizens vote. So there's a huge gap in terms of who is speaking up and making their voices heard. And we also see these demographic inequalities come up in terms of race and ethnicity. So this chart, for instance, shows that white people tend to make it out to vote more often than non-Hispanic Black folks, Hispanic folks, or other ethnicities. So that's a U.S. statistic, and here's some more statistics on the U.S. We can see ethnicity for one, but also age. So 18 to 29-year-olds are way less likely to vote than older people. And things haven't changed a ton, although the 60-plus population is perhaps voting more. So again, there might be a worry about lack of representation. We can also think about this in terms of amounts of education. So the less educated people, say people with less than a high school degree, are much less likely to vote than a person with a high school degree as compared to a college grad, as compared to someone with a graduate degree. So there is documented statistics about inequities in terms of who is actually showing up to the ballot box. So Birch's big idea here is that there's a certain kind of lack of fairness involved with low voter turnout. So she points out that there's three different kinds of fairness that we might be concerned about when we concern about how fairness might be promoted through the promotion of compulsory voting. So here are the three dimensions. So the first one she brings out is called political fairness. And the thought here is that if we want a fair society, we need fairness in terms of political representation. So the idea is we need to give an equal voice to all citizens, and that giving an equal voice to all citizens is a fundamental part of treating each citizen with respect. She then points to social fairness. And this gets us to a lot of these points about inequality in terms of who is turning out to the ballot box. So she points out that there has been some research suggesting that the more equality of representation you have in terms of voter turnout, there's going to be more equality of wealth distribution. So that comes in terms of income equality. And it's also going to be a matter of representation and responsiveness to the electorate. So if we jump back to these statistics about inequities that we looked at before, we might think that a government that is elected by more white people, by more postgraduates, and by older people is going to be geared more towards their interests than the interests of the young, the black, those who haven't received as many educational opportunities. So that's where this second kind of fairness is going to really come through for Birch. Remember, and she's calling that kind of fairness social fairness. So if you want, representatives that are responsive to your concerns, we're going to want to make sure that the people who are actually voting are going to be representative of the population as a whole. And then here's a third kind, and Birch calls this kind of fairness procedural fairness. She argues that when we think about how we set up our democracy, the costs and burdens of running a democracy should be distributed equally. So the thought here is, when you participate in a democracy, you are doing a certain kind of work, right? And insofar as it's a kind of work, it's a certain kind of burden to do your democratic duty, we need to ensure that everybody does their part in making their say. So these are sort of the kinds of dimensions that Birch is concerned about. Along with these questions about legitimacy, she also thinks that when we increase voter turnout, we have more fairness. So now we're going to run through some objections to this proposal of increasing voter turnout through making voting compulsory. That is, making it the case that you would be punished, usually with a nominal fine, for not voting. So here's the first objection. And it says, well, we shouldn't make voting mandatory because the right to vote is also a right not to vote. But Birch says that's not right. She follows another legal scholar, Heather Lardy, who says it's actually not logically the case. Not everything you have the right to do is also a right you have not to do. So even though you have a right to educate your children, you don't have the right to not educate them or give them no education whatsoever. So we might think of other cases involving things like compelled speech. And we might also notice the point that freedom in voting, perhaps, might be freedom to vote among your options, but the freedom is not extending all the way to not voting at all. So just to further this point, Birch points out, again, going along with Lardy, that there's nothing inherently unjustifiable about certain government requirements on individuals. So we might think of things like a requirement to serve on a jury or a requirement to pay taxes is something that the government reasonably requires you to do. So then the question is, well, why not just take the set of things that the government requires you to do, and within this set we would have things like paying taxes and serving on juries when called to do so, and then just add another civic duty to that, that duty of voting. Okay, let's move on to Objection 2. Objection 2 says, compulsory turnout will mask disaffection or dissatisfaction. So the thought would be, the more voter turnout decreases, so the lower it gets, the more that might indicate that society does not see any particular political party as representing their own particular views. So in response, Birch points out that some disaffection will actually be fixed by increasing participation because the electorate will be made more responsive. Or we'll say that representatives and our democracy as a whole will become more responsive to the actual opinions of the electorate. But moreover, she points out that there's not a clear link between turnout and voter satisfaction. So just because turnout gets really low, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good indication of dissatisfaction in the first place. So again, she's going to appeal to empirical studies there, and if you want to look further into that, you should take a peek at exactly where Birch makes this claim in the paper. Okay. Objection 3 might be that the quality of votes will be lower when we make voting mandatory. So the thought here is that some people don't vote because they're not informed. And maybe they're doing just what they should do when a person is not informed. They just abstain from voting. So when we looked at Jason Brennan earlier, he argued pretty much along these lines, not in the paper that we read, but he's argued elsewhere, that it's actually a perfectly good thing that a person would stay home and not make their voice heard when they realize to themselves that they don't know what they're talking about. And there's a further worry that when we make people vote, that might be the cause of people arbitrarily voting for extremist parties. On the first thing, Birch agrees that there may be some lower quality votes, and it has been found that there are more spoiled ballots in compulsory voting. And there's a little bit of discussion of that in the documentary, the brief documentary about the Australian voting system, that you get people checking every single box, or elections where there's a pattern of just the first person on the ballot turning out to win. So there might be lower quality voting. She does admit that. But she does also point out that when we look at the empirical evidence, there's no evidence of increased extremism. And she's also pointed out that a lot of research has shown that a lot of people who don't vote do have considered opinions and do have a sense of what their interests are. So we do have to realize that by forcing everyone to come out to vote, we might be getting some extra low-quality voters out there, but there are a lot of high-quality voters that we would also be adding to the ballot box. So moving on, Objection 4. Objection 4 says it would be undemocratic to switch to compulsory voting if most people aren't in favor of it. And Birch points out that, admittedly, 36% of the UK supported compulsory voting, which involves like a fine for not voting in 2009. But she points out here that public opinion is changeable. So advocates for this reform should make the case for it. Because then, if we got support up to the level of 51% or 60%, then it would be more legitimate to make that switch. So I guess the thing that Birch is pointing out here is we've got some work to do if we're in favor of bringing in compulsory voting. And moreover, that the level of support for compulsory voting that we have nowadays doesn't have to be a fixed matter of fact. With the right kind of campaigning, that might actually change. Objection 5. It's the idea that compulsory voting would reduce rather than increase legitimacy. Remember, the thought about legitimacy is that when we have the consent of everyone who's governed, that makes the government's use of coercive power legitimate. And Birch suggests that in the wrong situation, legitimacy could be reduced by forcing everybody out to the ballot box. So she thinks that we should only be implementing compulsory voting through a referendum. So she's not saying that we should institute compulsory voting in any way possible, but we should do it in the right way if we're going to do it. Here's Objection 6. It's that, this is our last objection, it's that mandatory voting would have to be enforced with a regime of sanctions or penalties. And Birch responds to this that that's true. That's sort of a bullet that she's going to have to bite as a defender of compulsory voting, that there's actually going to have to be some sort of coercive measure to compel a person to vote. But we could find ways of setting such a system up justly. So for instance, we could give a person a hardship allowance if a person doesn't have the time to vote because they are a single parent with 2 jobs and a lot of responsibilities to deal with. Or if a person has a severe disability, that might give people sort of a bit of leeway. And she also suggests that maybe putting a none of the above option onto a ballot would be an excellent way to make people feel like they're not being forced to speak up for any particular candidate or for a random candidate that they don't actually support. So just some final thoughts that come through in Birch's defense of compulsory voting. She says that many of the objections to compulsory voting are often going to overlook the kinds of details that go into a well thought out policy. So things like hardship accommodations and making sure that there's reasonable access for everyone. She also points out, and this is sort of an interesting little suggestion at the end of the paper. She says that fairness doesn't technically require the participation of every single citizen, but she points out that non-participation should not systematically disadvantage any group of citizens. So the thought here is that there might be a setup for voting where we just make sure that a certain percentage of people are allowed to vote, such that we make sure that 60% of young people and 60% of middle-aged people and 60% of people 65 and older turn out to the ballot box. But there are questions here. For instance, whether we could keep track of how these demographics are turning up to the elections, whether we would require people to stay home for a certain number of elections. Say, for instance, if you had too many older folks turning up to the polls. But the thought is, maybe we could set up non-participation in a systematic way such that there wouldn't be a systematic disadvantage for any particular group of citizens. Birch is insistent and claims to have empirical support for the thought that implementing compulsory voting would, in fact, protect the interests of the less affluent because parties would have to compete more for their votes, given that it's a sure thing that they will be turning up at the ballot box. So, with these points taken together, we have concerns about legitimacy and social unrest as part of Birch's case for compulsory voting, along with objections from 3 different kinds of fairness. Remember, there's political fairness, which is about making sure that everybody's say is heard. You've got social fairness, which is about making sure that voting is representative of every part of the population. And then also procedural fairness, making sure that the burdens and work of participating in democracy are distributed equally among its citizens. So I'll leave it to you to ponder whether this argument about mandatory voting, which Birch is making about the United Kingdom, is also applicable to the United States. And we might wonder whether the argument here is going to be a weaker one or a stronger one. So we'll pick up that thread of discussion in the forums. And then later in the week, we're going to be looking at a paper critical of compulsory voting in Annabelle Lever's paper, Is Compulsory Voting Justified? So, thanks for listening in today, and I will look forward to hearing what you have to say about Birch's proposals for compulsory voting. So thanks for listening in, and take care. All right.